can kind of get started. And I wanted to make sure I came to you and continue to talk about ancient Kush and Kermit. I'm going to be doing this for a while as we go along. I'm going to continue to do this. And I want to say God bless you to those who've supported me and started to share and have comments around it. I'm going to try to do this on a regular basis as much as I can. So if you have things you'd like to talk about, let me know. But if you enjoy just coming here at 7 o'clock every night and just hearing some things about ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, ancient Kush, various things about African history and ancient African history, I'll ask you to join me. I'm going to try to be here for the next couple of days at 7 o'clock and do as much as I can. But, also ask you to share this. Tell somebody about this. This is our lives, our history, our ability to talk about things that are not talked about in school. We can talk about it. We can share documentation. We can give our children upfront, firsthand accounts, really accounts from the people who were there, because we can look at that documentation and tell our children what really happened and talk about it. So I want to kind of continue the conversation about the autobiography of Weni. I want to thank you for those of us who supported me and those of us who are here. And I'll ask that you share this with somebody, like it, and share this with somebody. But I want to continue to talk about the autobiography of Weni that we were talking about and his travels with respect to ancient Kush and ancient Kemet and various things with respect to what he wrote in terms of autobiography. But as we think about just the land of Kush, and I mentioned, as you see up here, there's more than just one part of ancient Kush. There's more than just one part of ancient Nubia. We talk about Nubia, and Nubia is like, a region. It's really like a region and not just one group of people, even though there are Nubian people. And we tend to sometimes take this entire region that's right along the Nile in the northern part of Sudan, going in the southern part of what is today Egypt, and we kind of lump everybody together. But they're different people, there are different customs, different societies that develop that we should be distinct about. And sometimes we'll use one thing that happened to make it seem like it was a whole thing. So it's important for us to distinguish between what was going on in Kerma, in Upper Nubia, in the southern part of Nubia, what was going on with the Sea group people in Lower Nubia around the Old Kingdom, and what was going on with the Medjay, which we were talking about yesterday. And as I want to give you some perspective on that, I wanted to share just some background. You'll see here, this is a part of the ancient site of the city of Kerma. Now, this is the seat, the city, if you will, that's the seat of Kush's power. This would become Kushite power over centuries, really. And it's a vast site that's in there in upper Nubia and what is today the Sudan. And it really has, as a part of it, an entire religious complex, as you can see. It's not just the site itself, but it's a religious complex, and it's not just the city of Kerma. Kush would develop into not just one particular area, but it would spread out over a large area and have a lot of influence, as we will see. So as we start to talk about ancient Kush and Upper Nubia and the southern part of Nubia, we're going to talk about Kush within the context of the kingdom that's there and how it spread out beyond just small areas that were right there in the upper part of Nubia. So let's get into it. Let's talk about that and set that up within the context of the documentation that we know about it. And so as I was mentioning, and I'll kind of go back and share a little bit just so we can kind of remember and move forward there. But, as we mentioned that there are various aspects of the Nile Valley, right? There isn't just one Nile Valley, and there isn't this major force field or some huge door stopping people from going up and down the Nile 3,000, 5,000 years ago. And as you think about Kush and you think about Nubia, you look at Nubia within the context of there being a lower Nubia to the north and an upper Nubia as you get closer to the highlands of Ethiopia in the south of that. And upper Nubia is in what is today modern day Sudan. It's in what is modern day Sudan. And lower Nubia is in what is today modern day Egypt. So when you think about that, Lower Nubia was a part of what is today Egypt. And when you think about going back even farther, even 3800 BC, 5,800 years ago, you will find that certain groups of people who were A group people that they call archaeologists, they were in what is today modern Egypt, and they were in what was back then what would become ancient Kemet. So the southern border of ancient Kemet was really at the first cataract right there. It was really at the first cataract right below Aswan. That was the southern border of Kemet. But before Kemet is a country, before Kemet is joined to the two lands, there are people all up and down there, and there are people all up in there afterwards, right? And so there are people who were A group Nubians whose graves and artifacts are found within that area above the southern border of what will become Kemet, 3,800 years before Christ. They're there, and they stretch all the way down to the second cataract or thereabouts. And there's a famous Custal incense burner. There are all kinds of artifacts that we can talk about. And as we said that, I want to kind of share some of the things that they found. And I've given you some pictures and some sharing some of these artifacts. But there are numerous different types of artifacts that you can find with respect to people where they were either Nubian artifacts found in ancient Egypt before Egypt was a country. So they had trade going on. Anything from the bowls that you see up here and this wonderful red and black pottery that they have to other types of things that you can find. Kemetic resources that are in what is Nubian, what would become Kush, and Nubian resources that are found in Kemetic graves up there in the lower part and upper part of Kemet. So trade is going on up and down the Nile 5,000 years ago. 5,800 years ago, trade is going on. I wanted to point out something that was very interesting. I thought that I'd show. I'll kind of pull this up really big. You can see this is a bowl. This is a beautiful container and vase here, pottery. And they did all kinds of pottery up and down the Nile Valley in Nakkada and in Upper Egypt and Upper Kemet, going all the way down into Kush, all kinds of beautiful pottery there. But you'll notice this is something that's pre-dynastic. It's before Kemet becomes a country. And notice how you see the people here. This is a boat. So this pot right here is older than ancient Kemet. And what you see depicted on it is a boat. And there are people on the boat. And they're performing some type of ceremony, or, obviously I don't know exactly what they're doing because we can only guess at what we believe they're doing. They're performing what might be some type of ceremony, religious ceremony. But it's interesting to me because when we think about the technology related to boats and to traveling up and down now, we really don't give it credit. We talk about boats and ships and travel in other places around the world. And I've shared this story before, even though people will say, oh, no, this never happened. I've shared this story where I was in school at one point in time, a long time ago in junior high school. And I remember, and the teacher told me that the first people in the world to develop boats were the Vikings. The first people in the world to develop boats, they were European and they were the Vikings. People were kind of questioning that, but she was adamant. And I didn't have the information or the wherewithal to combat her in school and in college, or in school and in class like that. I was in junior high school. I didn't have the wherewithal to combat her, but I knew in my heart that there were people who did many things around the world. And there's no disrespect to the Viking people, but people did many things around the world with respect to technology and development. We just don't talk about it. We just don't know about it. And some people will disrespect, riverboats or disrespect what people are doing. But we're talking 5,800 years ago, there are depictions of boats on pots and people are going up and down the Nile doing all types of travel up and down the Nile. That's significant. And we also know that by 5,800 years ago, people had been in Australia for tens of thousands of years. I mean, like at least 50,000 years. People had been in Australia already for 50,000 years and it was surrounded by water. 5,000 years ago, they'd already been there for 50,000 years. So human beings find a way to get around the world. And that's important for us to think about. But I wanted to also point out with respect to this piece of pottery, notice the woman who's right there on the side as I kind of blow it up. Notice how the women are shaped, right? So you can see male figures over here to the right. You see female figures. And over here on the far left of it, you see a woman whose hands are kind of up like this. So kind of in a heart shape like. And it's a beautiful depiction. And when you see that, you know there must be something significant because you can start to see other types of things like this particular piece right here, which comes from around the same period where you find female figures similarly shaped with the bottom kind of being somewhat hippie and the arms kind of raised in a certain way, perhaps doing some type of ceremony. You find these figurines a lot of times in tombs because much of what you know and what we know about ancient Kemet before it was a country, before it became a dynasty, if you will, and dynasties, is from graves. You know that from graves. You know that from the Nubian people. You know a lot about how they buried people. So these figurines were found in graves and you can see striking, resemblance and just beautiful artwork 5,800 years ago, 5,500 years ago. And this was a woman from ancient Egypt. And this was also a Nubian woman in here. A Nubian female figurine that's depicted in a similar type of way where the bottom half is a bit hippier and you kind of see like they're wearing a long dress and you understand that there's something going on here. There's some type of intelligence, there's some type of ceremony, there's some type of interaction that's going on here that's being depicted. And it's well before ancient Kemet as a country, well before anybody gives them credit for what they're doing. I want to propose, I believe that there are a lot of things ancient people did all over the world and in particular in Africa that we just don't know about and never talked about, that we just don't know. I believe there are things that happen in Africa that happened so long ago that they're covered up maybe in the sand now or grown over or sometimes underwater like an Aswan Dam. There are various places that they're just covered up or just unexcavated or not talked about. I believe there's a lot more to history in Africa than what we talk about. And I want to share as much as I can share with you today. As I mentioned, so you see these figurines and how they kind of present themselves. I mentioned you can see the same type of depiction as I mentioned on this pot right here, where you see female figurines and them and the woman dressed and kind of positioned like that. So you find that there is a definite culture. There's a definite interaction, and this is up and down the Nile. It's not just in one part of ancient Kemet. It's up and down the Nile. But when you think about the area where we found a lot of these artifacts, a lot of these things with respect to Kemet, you're talking right around here, right around the southern part of Kemet. So in a place called Nakada, around Abydos, around Nekhen, you find areas right in the southern part of Kemet. That's where they find a lot of these ancient or the very old pre-dynastic things that we're talking about. Right there in Nakada, right there in up would be southern Kemet, what would become southern Kemet. So this is an area that people are there. People are frequenting, people are living, they're dying, they're building graves, they're having relationships. This is all happening prior to Egypt becoming a country. And as you think about that, these same things are happening in Kush. When we think about the Nubian people, the up and down the Nile, this is happening in Kush too. This is not just happening in Egypt. If you think about Kemet and you think about the gold, you think about the ivory, you think about some of the precious hardwoods, even some of the precious stones that are not found in Egypt, not found in Kemet, that are found farther south, Egypt probably almost wouldn't be Egypt. It wouldn't have the same type of artifacts. You wouldn't have the same type of remarkable things if it wasn't for the connections and the trade that went on up and down the Nile, because a lot of the resources and a lot of major resources came from farther south. And that's true of almost any country, right? You are connected with the people you trade with and the resources you get for them that you use, whatever those resources might be they stones, gold, whatever that might be. So this is happening also in Kush. And so as you think about up and down Kush, as you take a look at some of them, I wanted to kind of share this too. This is an even older piece of pottery that's about 3,800 years before Christ or thereabout. This is a slightly older piece. And you see, once again, boats depicted. You see animals depicted. You clearly see that people are having relationships. They have a religion. They have rites and ceremonies that they're practicing. And this is up and down and out. And it seems to be one culture. All there's distinctions. There's absolutely distinctions between a group people and other people who might have lived there. There is definitely cultural connection. It's almost like saying, if somebody's from Chicago and another person's from, I don't know, New York, somebody says pop and somebody says soda, but they have a shared cultural connection. Even though they may be far away, they may also interact as well. So there's definitely an interaction going on here. There's definitely a shared culture taking place. But as I mentioned, this is happening in Kush too. So I want to kind of set up what's happening on the Kush side of things, right? Because if we think about ancient Kush, you can go back 3,500 years before Christ. You can go back to 3,500 BC, and you will find that an area that they call Kerma, right there where the third cataract of the Nile is, right there. And this is the site of Kerma right here. This area right here is being developed and becoming an early area of urbanization. As the Sahara Desert dried out, people started coming closer and closer into the Nile. And this city right here became a significant city that people began to urbanize, really just join together in larger groups and set up camp, basically in a settlement right there where you said Kerma right there. That's where that site is. That's where the ancient site of Kerma is. And you see this 3,500 years before Christ. This area is an urban area. It is being inhabited. You have storage facilities. You have animal pens. You have religious sites. You have homes that are there. You have people trading. We know that there are trade routes going up and down here, and you can find ancient seals, which are clearly used to mark trade as it passes through Kerma, going from the central part of Africa, further south in Africa, and going up through Kerma as like a choke point, if you will, and going out to Kemet, farther north, and even to the Mediterranean. We can see that with numerous depictions and examples and artifacts of seals used in a way to trade, as well as the items that you find up and down the Nile, coming from farther south, and you find them in Egypt and vice versa. So there was definitely trade going on, and this is 3,500 years before Christ. In Kerma, in the Sudan, before Egypt is a Kemet, before the first dynasty. This is not only happening in Egypt and in Kemet, it's happening in Kush too. And then what happens around 2500 BC? Around 2500 BC, a new kind of organization arises, a new kind of kingdom, if you will, arises in Kush, if you will, in the area that's right around Kerma. And Kerma is like its capital. So this is another view of the video I just showed you earlier. This is another view of that place. And this is, the video I was showing you was from the top of it. So if you take a look at it, this is the Western Dufufa, they call it. It's a mud brick temple, a huge temple that was the center of the culture and the city life in Kerma around 2500 BC and thereafter. And that place, just to give you another perspective of it, this is the top of that place right here. So this is taking a view looking out from the top of that Dufufa, looking out over the city. And you can see plans for all types of architecture. You see circular types of things. You see rectangular types of things. These would have been homes. These would have been religious buildings, religious facilities in there. They would have been all kinds of things in this area. They would have had storage facilities. And it's not just this site. You will find that there are other places beyond this site that were other places were domestic places where people lived. You would find that there was a palace on this area. There's also a huge audience hall where the king and the royalty would meet and talk to people. This was all there in ancient Kerma. And this began to develop even more about 2500 BC. And that becomes what some people refer to as like the first kingdom of Kush, the first rise of Kush. The predecessor for Kush was already there, and it may have been called Kush. We're not even sure what they call themselves, right? This is what the name was given to by ancient Kemetic people and what's kind of stuck right there. But what the rise of this major new formation, if you will, begins to pop up around 2500 BC, and this area of Kerma becomes the center of that. It's the center of that. So when we talk about what's the corresponding thing that's happening in ancient Kemet as this is happening in Nubia and in Kush, what's happening there? Or this time, ancient Kemet, they've already built the pyramids in Dynasty 4. And the autobiography of Weni that we were talking about, that autobiography of Weni is something that's happening right around this time. It's happening around 2200 BC or thereabouts. And when the autobiography of Weni takes place, King Pepi, who I'll give you a big picture of so you can take a look at him. King Pepi the First was one of the kings that Weni actually took and was one of his officials in the court and in the regime of King Pepi the First right here. This was a King Pepi from the 6th dynasty. So he was one of the kings that he worked under. So when this was happening, ancient Kemet was flourishing. Ancient Kemet was using all types of architecture, all types of things. And this wasn't a situation where ancient Kemet went down to Kush and just said, you know what, I'm going to just take you over. I'm going to just kind of, punk you out, or I'm just going to take advantage of you. This was not the case. And this is why it's so important, because when you start to see what was going on in ancient Kush, you realize and understand that there were more people, more things that were happening in and around this area, around people that you have to think about. It wasn't just the people in Kush, there were C group people as well. And so many times people will hear, something that happened under King Pepi, right? And they may say something happened and the ancient Kemetic people went out to Nubia and they took over Nubia, or they took people prisoners. Many times, especially during this time, during the Old Kingdom, they're not talking about Kush. They're talking about C group. They're talking about people in Lower Nubia, where there's a distinction, right? So as I mentioned, there were different people in Lower Nubia, and the Weni in his autobiography, that's what we were talking about last night, Weni in his autobiography, in his tomb in Abydos, talks about having several different types of Nubian people in his army when he went to go fight, when they had to fight the Asiatic sand dwellers, as they called them. So a lot of times they're talking about C group people in Lower Nubia, and they're not talking about Kush, as we talked about. So as I kind of push this, I want to kind of pull up some of those names, because as I mentioned, we were talking about the autobiography of Weni here, this resource. So if you get a chance to take a look at it, it's one of the things you can read. It's one of the pieces of documentation. And I'll be going over all the stuff if I'm able to. I'll be talking about the pyramid texts and teachings of Kajemni and the teachings of Ptah-hotep. And I'll be going through a lot of these resources so you know more about them, so you'll know what's in them, right? So that's what we're talking to you about it. And then this autobiography is one of the seminal resources, one of the seminal pieces of history that you can look at when you want to know about what's going on in ancient Kemet and what's happening in ancient Kush and ancient Nubia in the Old Kingdom. It's this autobiography of Weni. And Weni said in his autobiography, as you might know, as you remember from last night, he was an official. He was living in the southern part of ancient Kemet. He worked under several kings, in the 6th dynasty, and he was called upon to do a number of things. He was called upon to kind of work with a war that was taking place and to organize some army, organize an army to be able to fight people who were going to be attacking them or rising up against ancient Kemet in the northern part of the city, and northern part of the country. And he mentions that he had, as among the people in his army, he mentions several group of Nubians. And it wasn't just Nubians. There were people from Libya. There were people from ancient Kemet. But he mentions a large amount of Nubians that were part of his army. And this is where people get the first indication, one of the early indications that ancient Nubian people fought in Kemetic armies in large numbers from early on, from the Old Kingdom on. You find this here. You're going to find documents in the Middle Kingdom. You find it in the New Kingdom. You find depictions of ancient Nubians as soldiers. It's not just as simple as we trampled them on our foot. People want to show you like a slipper or something like that and say they trampled on their foot. That's not as simple as that, and that's not what the records say. So if you look at the Urjet Nubians, the Wawet Nubians, the Cow Nubians, the Medjay, who we've talked about, the Yam Nubians, these are all people that Weni in his autobiography, the autobiography of Weni, mentioned were part of his army, was a part of the army that he was controlling. And in addition to the people from Kemet, and in addition to people who were from Libya, basically, who were part of his army, all of these people were part as well. So it becomes a significant thing. And I'll just check in to see if there's any, like, we have any questions as we're coming through, as I'm looking at, just take a look at if there's any questions in the chat. But they become very significant. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. So that becomes very significant. So you find that they're not only talking about a few people, they're talking about several people. So when you start to talk about what's happening in Kush and what's happening in Nubia, distinguish for yourself Lower Nubia. Think about more than just one type of people, more than one peoples. There were different societies there. Understand that the Urjet are there in Lower Nubia, the Wawet are there, the Medjay are to the east, and probably they will call Yam and Kush will be further south in what is Upper Nubia. So by the time that we're dealing with this and we're working through this, by the time we get to 2500 BC, Kush is a power. Kemet is a power. Kemet is definitely a power. Kush is also a power. It's not as if ancient Kemet is just running over Kush. And it becomes to a point that when they start to get to the Middle Kingdom of ancient Kemet, and this is the founder of the Middle Kingdom, by the way, Mentuhotep II, he's the founder of the Middle Kingdom in the 11th dynasty in ancient Kemet. By the time they get him and after him, once you get to the 12th dynasty, you find ancient Kemetic people making and building significant forts. They start to build forts around the Nile Valley. They started to build forts around the Nile Valley, and I'll kind of give you a picture of Mentuhotep, just so you can see him. I love this picture of him, by the way. He's the founder of the Middle Kingdom. By the time he comes into power, and after him during the 11th dynasty, during the 12th dynasty, is when ancient Kemet starts to build remarkable forts, huge forts they start to build around the second cataract and just beyond the second cataract of the Nile. And the reason why they're building is, like, why are they building these forts? They're intricate forts. You look at the ruins of them, and they do replicas and kind of reenactments and then refurbish them, if you will, and to see what they might have looked like. You start to see that these were elaborate forts, and they were facing Kush. They were facing Kush for a reason. They were facing Kush because Kush was a powerhouse. A lot of people will say things like, the ancient Kemetic people tried to make these people afraid. You really got to think about this differently, because Kush was a powerhouse and an important trading partner. And ancient Kemet wanted to control that trade. And there were times when Kush pushed further up in Lower Nubia and took over those regions as well. And ancient Kemet wanted to respond. So it wasn't just like it was just a one-sided relationship. And you find, and people say the same thing like Abu Simbel and things like that, that they made those facing Kush so that they could scare the Nubians. I mean, you really got to stop and think realistically about this and look more at the record and not think that it's just a one-sided relationship that's going on. It really is much, much deeper than that. So as we're thinking about that, as they start to go through the Middle Kingdom and you start to get around 2000 BC, you find that ancient Kerma, ancient Kush is a powerhouse. They're in their heyday. I mean, you really start to see almost the power of ancient Kush is in its heyday. The trade is really popping off, if you will, up and down the Nile Valley. You will find that ancient Kush was trading not only with ancient Kemet further north, they were trading with people from Central Africa. That's where they get a lot of their panther skins from, and ebony and ivory and things like that. And they were trading with people for the Red Sea. And as you go on, this kingdom of Kush and the early part of Kerma, as I mentioned, this early part of Kerma lasts for 1,000 years. And then you start to have the other rise of the kingdom of Kush, and that lasts for another 1,000 years. So we're not talking about 200 or 300 years. And after the Kemetic people came and took over Kush and took over them during the New Kingdom around 1500 BC or so, when they left, when that was over and they were dismissed, if you will, the Kushite people rose up again and they went on for another 1,000 years. So you're talking about 3,000 years of history. They were not some pushover, fly by night kind of panty any type of people. There was really significance there. And as you start to look at the record, you said that the ancient Kush and the ancient Kushite people really rose up several times to be a significant power. So we'll be talking more about this, more of the documentation around this. God bless you. I thank you for listening. Please share this with somebody. Let me know if you have any other questions and things you want to talk about. I'll definitely be talking about, but I appreciate you for joining.